Hello and welcome to DocTalk, the educational and informational conversational series. I am Jayashree Mani, clinical nutritionist at PERQUE Integrative Health, and I have Dr. Russell Jaffe here, owner and founder of PERQUE Integrative Health. This is where LRA by Lysac testing, the gold standard in delayed allergy testing, and PERQUE nutraceuticals come together. Dr. Jaffe is in conversation with Dr. Robert Lustig here. Welcome, Dr. Lustig.
Thanks.
Dr. Lustig is a world-renowned expert in neuroendocrinology with a special focus on childhood obesity and diabetes, and he has led numerous global discussions on metabolic health and nutrition and advocates real food. Among others, Dr. Lustig is the author of the New York Times bestseller Fat Chance and is poised to launch his next endeavor very soon, Metabolical. Dr. Russell Jaffe and Dr. Lustig.
Thank you, Jayashree. Professor Lustig, you have been someone I've learned from over many years, and you're still synthesizing and bringing together the issues about cause more than consequence. And I wonder if you could help our audience understand why you think it's so important to treat the causes of ill health rather than the symptomatic consequences.
Well, first of all, Dr. Jaffe, thanks for having me, and thanks for that, glowing introduction. I appreciate it. I'll just give you one simple clinical vignette. What happens when you give an aspirin to a patient with a brain tumor because they have a headache? You're treating the symptom, you're not treating the cause. The cause is still there. And I would argue that the reason for us throwing more and more money at healthcare and having less and less of an effect on longevity, lifespan, health span, and environment and sustainability for that matter as well, is because we are treating the symptoms of disease, not the cause. This is particularly important in terms of these new chronic diseases. And they're not new, we've known about them forever, but the explosion in all of them is relatively new. It's occurred over the past 5 decades. And I'll name these diseases: type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, polycystic ovarian disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Currently, those 8 diseases take up 75% of the entire healthcare budget, which has now reached $3.8 trillion. And clearly we're not getting very much for that as lifespan and health span continue to decline. And the argument that I make is the reason is because those diseases that I have just mentioned, those 8 diseases, are not diseases. They are symptoms of disease. They are the manifestations of the real pathologies. And those pathologies are going on inside the cells of our body. And until we actually deal with those, we will never be able to undo the damage that is going on. And we will not be able to get out of this healthcare crisis that we have basically made for ourselves. So those 8 pathologies, none of them have ICD-11 codes, and none of them are known to doctors, and none of them are reimbursable, and none of them have drug therapy. So that's what the book, Metabolical, which by the way is right here, just got my copy. It comes out May 4th. That's what I'm talking about.
Indeed. Sounds like John Knowles, who famously was quoted as saying, "We spend ever more and we feel ever worse, and we call that the American healthcare system." Now, after running Mass General, he was running the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and eager to speed the transition from our current symptom-driven sick care, as Tom Harkin used to refer to it, to a true healthcare system that looks at risks and mitigates them, that looks at opportunities, that celebrates success, but that engages the person, not as a passive recipient of the prescription, but as a participant in their own health and well-being. And one of the things I've learned from you is that it matters if the doctor cares, and it matters if the doctor understands. And then we could get off into a discussion of curriculum and Flexner, but that's another interview.
Well, it's all part and parcel of the same thing. And it's interesting you brought up Rockefeller University. I was a peon at Rockefeller University for many years. And I thought that Flexner Hall was for Abraham Flexner.
No.
That's not. It's for Simon Flexner, who was the first president. But to be honest with you, it almost doesn't even matter, because those two brothers were joined at the hip, and they had one patron, both of them.
Well, they had two. No, they had two. They had Rockefeller and Carnegie.
Well, indeed. But the bottom line was that the reason for both of their endeavors, Flexner in terms of the Institute for Medical Research, Simon and Abraham in terms of overhauling medical education, were basically to serve John D. Rockefeller in his new enterprise, which was pharmaceuticals.
Even though he had a homeopathic physician.
That's right.
But he was making a fortune turning coal tar into aspirin and other derivatives that we now call biopharma, and magic bullets and Ehrlich and all of that.
Exactly right. So Rockefeller himself believed in folk cures, but he had all of this coal tar sitting, and he didn't know what to do with it. But it was shown to him that, in fact, coal tar could be used for various skin ailments and possibly other things, and turned into other things as well. And so his job, as it were, was to revamp the medical profession to be able to use coal tar to basically create an industry. He had already created one. He was out to create another. And so the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research sponsored many, many different projects back in 1901, only if they had some relation to coal tar.
Indeed, much later, Rene Dubose recruited me, and I almost went until I realized that the faculty housing and the tunnels would mean that I would never have to come up above ground. And
right.
that things would come and go, minions would come and go. I would never have to interact with mere mortals. And I thought, I'm a country boy. I think I'm going to go back to doing my research. And be careful, I'm a doubly board certified pathologist, so we're not all that bad.
And, well, I'm not saying that Simon was bad. I mean, he trained at
No,
Hopkins.
no, he was just Machiavellian. No.
Pennsylvania.
No, we have respect for what he accomplished, and he had a mission, and he found his patrons, and he served them well. Right. However, the consequences are what we're dealing with today. You wouldn't have Bayer, you wouldn't have Monsanto. I'm not even sure you'd have Nestle's without them.
I completely agree. Ultimately, their job was to get medicine onto the pharma track. And at that point, medicine was relatively unregulated. There was no standardized curriculum. Different medical schools did different things. And so you could make an argument that what happened both at Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research and also with the Flexner Report was absolutely essential. And perhaps it was. The one thing that was cut out, though, was the concept of nutrition. Abraham Flexner wrote his Flexner Report in 1910. The first vitamin, thiamine, was discovered and isolated in 1912. Did that change the concept of nutrition as Flexner knew it? And the answer is absolutely not. It did not change anything. In fact, the entire 20s and 30s were devoted to the development of vitamins as a primary driver of health and nutrition around the world, fixing global epidemics, and vitamins and nutrition never found their way into the medical curriculum.
Odd.
Well, not so odd when you understand the, who was behind it.
And yet there were people like Jean Maillet and the Tufts Nutrition Institute. There's Natick Nutrition for the feds. There are a lot of good people. Jim Duke, for example, did excellent work at USDA, but he was the odd person who advocated for wholeness, for organic and soil quality, etc. Where's the solution? So if we could jump to where's the solution, and forgive me, because there are many places along this track that we could meaningfully converse, but we only have a few minutes and the audience only has a certain amount of attention. If you would help us with your synthesis, your experience, and as others have said about you, this is not your first rodeo. Where do you see the opportunity, especially in this moment, change of administration, elevation of science, but meaningful science? You know, a difference without a meaning may not be worth supporting. Where do you see the opportunities? Where do you get hope?
Well, so the question you're asking is, how do you fix those diseases? And the answer is not with medicine. Medicine treats the symptoms of disease. So the high LDL is not the disease, it's the symptom of the disease. The high blood glucose is not the disease, it's the symptom of disease. The high blood pressure is not the disease, it's the symptom of disease. In order to be able to fix these diseases, and therefore fix healthcare, because you can't fix healthcare until you fix health. The second part of that is you can't fix health until you fix diet. And it turns out that every single one of those 8 subcellular pathologies I mentioned before, none of them are druggable. When you actually look at the molecular pathways, the cofactors, the co-repressors, the transcription factors, none of them have a drug target. They're all foodable. In order to fix these, we have to fix the food. And you were talking earlier about the partnership between physicians and patients in order for patients to be able to help themselves. Well, until physicians understand these 8 subcellular pathologies and the role that food plays in improving and promulgating health rather than causing these pathologies, we're never going to solve this problem, because there is no quick fix. There is no bypass to this. We basically have to take it head on. So let me just, for your audience, name the 8 pathologies, and you'll see that there's no ICD-11 code for any of them. Here we go. Number 1, glycation. Number 2, oxidative stress. Number 3, mitochondrial dysfunction. Number 4, insulin resistance. Number 5, membrane instability. Number 6, inflammation. Number 7, methylation. And number 8, autophagy. Each of these are things that go on inside the cell. And each of these can be fixed with food. But we are not fixing it with food. We are actually causing them to occur. If you ate right, you'd live to be 110 playing tennis. When you eat wrong, you're in a wheelchair at age 40 because you've got 2 stumps and you're on dialysis waiting for your next stroke. That's the difference. 70 years and all that health span based on what you eat, how you eat and what you eat. And the problem is physicians don't learn this, and dietitians still think it's about calories, which it's not. It has nothing to do with calories. This has to do with the inherent properties of the specific nutrients you consume. Dentists understood this, and then they dropped it because fluoride basically said, who's going to fill the seats? And so they started giving out lollipops. Bottom line is, every single one of these 8 subcellular pathologies can be fixed with real food. And what do I mean by real food? Really, I'm talking about food that comes out of the ground or animals that ate food that came out of the ground. That's simple. And there are 2 things that really matter the most. Protect the liver, feed the gut. Any food that does both is healthy. Any food that does neither is poison. Any food that does one or the other, but not both, is somewhere in the middle. And
You mentioned a very important but relatively new pathology that is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. You and I are both old enough to remember when Charlie Lieber and others were studying alcoholic fatty liver disease. There was no NAFLD until after, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe if you go back to 1960 and you look at the amount of high fructose and high fructose corn syrup in packaged and processed foods, with an offset of 10, 15 years, that tracks with the creation of NAFLD, this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Well, so high fructose corn syrup, the process was invented in 1957 by Marshall, described in Science. And then Takasaki at Saga Medical School in Japan operationalized it and scaled it. And we started importing high fructose corn syrup into the United States around 1975. But people didn't know what to do with it. And I actually have an apocryphal story about that. I have a colleague here at UCSF by the name of Steve Bonacera. He's a serotonin researcher. His father worked for Firmenich, which is one of the flavor companies.
Right.
And he was assigned to high fructose corn syrup. And he knew back in the early 70s that something was not right about this compound. Something did not make sense, and something was inherently problematic about this compound, but he never could, from a scientific standpoint, isolate what the issue was. And so it ended up in all of, all the baked goods, and of course, New Coke. That was the switch from sugar to high fructose corn syrup. And now, it pervades our entire foodscape. But that happened around 1975. The first report of a patient with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease from Mayo Clinic proceedings was by Dr. John Ludwig in 1980. Now, whether or not that temporal relation is, causative or not is still yet to be determined. But ultimately, we went from 0 cases of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease 40 years ago to now fully 45% of American adults and 30% of American children having a disease that they don't even know they have, and that didn't even exist 40 years ago. This is the true epidemic, and it really is a pandemic because it is true in every other country as well, not to the same extent as ours. And most importantly, it is the primary driver of insulin resistance and chronic metabolic disease.
But didn't Fred Stair from the Harvard School of Public Health teach us that fructose was perfect? It didn't change insulin. It would fool Mother Nature, and it was without consequence.
And put it into breakfast cereal.
He was handsomely paid as a consultant to companies that found it profitable to do that.
That's right.
And they think of themselves as packaged goods companies. They don't. If you talk to them, they talk about themselves as what they are, packaged goods processing companies. If you want them to talk about whole food, they will send you to another department.
That's right. So the bottom line is there were several scientists that helped the food industry move this along through the 60s and 70s. Fred Stair is, prima facie example number 1. And we actually now have caught him in his lie because we have the documents at UCSF. We have a food industry documents library that shows the subterfuge that went on between Stair, Mark Hegsted, who became head of the USDA, and the sugar industry to exonerate sugar and finger saturated fat as the bad guy in terms of heart disease, with 2 New England Journal of Medicine review articles back in 1967. So we know now what happened. We didn't know back then, but we know now. Stair and Hegsted are, 2 of them. And
Mark Hegsted, just for context, Mark Hegsted advised the United States Senate under Senator McGovern with the dietary goals for Americans. And I will just slip this in. When I advocated for entry-level nutrition as part of the health professionals curriculum, Mark had me blackballed from the American College of Nutrition under Mildred Seelig, who came to me and said, Mark's not your friend. And I said, what do I do? And she said, you do nothing. I'm appointing you to the National Nutrition Consortium. You'll see what he says.
Well, glad to hear that somebody there had some cojones.
She did.
This was a major problem, and ultimately, it was like the nutritional mafia, and they really sort of did control with a very iron fist for a very long time. And this is how processed foods, sort of made their way from the laboratory into, everyone's stomach over the course of those 40 years, and everyone got sick. And it was assumed, well, it was calories, and you eat too much or exercise too little. I mean, calorie is basically code for it's your fault.
Blame the victim.
Blame the victim. That's exactly right. And I refuse to do that. And I can't do that because I'm a pediatrician. Okay, and you can't blame children for their diseases. They didn't cause them. And you specifically cannot blame newborns. And we now know that newborns around the world, Russia, Israel, South Africa, United States, now weigh 200 grams more at birth on average than they did 25 years ago. And when you do the DEXA scanning on those newborns, it's all fat. So we now have.
But didn't we solve that problem? Moms are eating more. Isn't that making healthier, fatter, chubbier babies?
Well, once you make a fat cell, it's there forever. And that's the problem. And not only are we making fattier fat cells, but we're making fattier livers right off the bat. And there are now several several animal studies that demonstrate that what the pregnant mother ate has everything to do with how that neonate will ultimately develop and what chronic diseases they will get and when. And I'm worried that that sugar beverage consumption during pregnancy is perhaps the most insidious toxin of all. And the Brookings Institute just like 2 days ago released a press report about this exact topic. So yes, I'm very.
Price and Pottinger are smiling wherever they are.
Yes.
We have had informations. We have had
is a hero of my book, by the way.
Oh, deservedly, fellow pediatrician. We have chosen to let business drive nutrition rather than having educated consumers that want nutritious and delicious foods. I had the pleasure of meeting with the CEO of Quaker at one time and other similar people. Every one of them wanted to know how to bring back whole foods into their profitable business. Quaker? Remember the Quaker Doughboy? No, he wasn't a Doughboy. Sorry, that was Pillsbury.
Pillsbury.
My programming is off. But Quaker presents itself as nature's purveyor to people.
Nothing is better for thee than me.
There you go. There you go. Thank you.
That was Quaker.
Right.
I totally understand. The fact of the matter is that business has driven this, and the fact is they have not been interested in the issue because they found their juggernaut, and their juggernaut, for lack of a better word, was sugar. Sugar basically changed the playing field. Now, sugar has been available for thousands of years. The Indians knew about it in 1200 BC. They took sugar cane and basically boiled it down to a brown syrupy stuff, which they called khanda.
Right, or jaggery or gur, but yes.
That's where we get the word candy from.
Right.
Yeah. So, it's been around for a long time, but we never in these doses. And ultimately, the dose determines the poison. We were designed to consume very little added sugar, in the same way we were designed to consume very little alcohol. And it turns out that the fructose molecule of sugar, sucrose or high fructose corn syrup or maple syrup, honey, agave, it doesn't matter. They're all the same metabolically. The fructose molecule and the alcohol molecule are metabolized in the liver and in the brain virtually identically. And this is why children get the diseases of alcohol without alcohol. Type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease prior to 1980 were the diseases of alcohol. But children don't drink alcohol, but it doesn't matter because their liver can't tell the difference because they are metabolized virtually identically. And not only that, but they also act on the brain virtually identically because they both activate the reward center. And in high dose, they are addictive because they activate the reward center. Everything that activates the nucleus accumbens in the brain in extreme and chronically is addictive. So you can have addictive chemicals such as cocaine, amphetamine, nicotine, alcohol, sugar, heroin, okay? Or you can have behaviors, shopping, gambling, social media, internet gaming, pornography. All of them cause dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. And all of them in the extreme lead to addiction. There's a holic after every one of those. Shopaholic, sexaholic, chocoholic, alcoholic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, well, there's a sugarholic, and it's really easy to figure out who is because they'll tell you, oh, I have a horrible sweet tooth, because it's socially acceptable to do that. They don't usually come out and say, I have an alcohol problem, okay? But they're perfectly happy to say, oh, I have a horrible sweet tooth. And that's because it's still socially acceptable. Bottom line is, it's the same thing. And so the food industry learned as they started pushing out processed food, the more sugar they added, the more we bought and the more money they made. And this was their juggernaut. This was their secret weapon because they were able to take their annualized profit margin from 1% prior to 1975 to 5% after 1975 because of the added sugar that they put in the food. And we even have an economic indicator that this is true. It's called price elasticity. So price elasticity, for those in your audience who don't understand it, is how much will a food consumption go down when the price goes up. So when you increase the price on something, that reduces effective availability. That will result in a consumption reduction. But the question is how much? If consumption goes down a lot, then we refer to that as price elastic. An example of that would be eggs. When the price of eggs go up, people stop eating eggs. That's simple. So price inelastic things means that the price goes up and consumption doesn't budge. People still want their fix. And it turns out the three most price inelastic items in the grocery store are fast food, soft drinks, and juice. So they know that when they add it, you buy more because
it's called the crave factor.
Absolutely.
They study it.
Absolutely.
Sugar, fat, and salt in the right combinations addict the tongue and the brain, and profits flow.
Well, so fat and salt are not addictive. They
No,
increase the salience.
but bad fat and bad salt are not good for you.
Well, so what fat and salt do is they increase the salience of sugar. So fat increases the salience of sugar. Which would you rather have, a Cinnabon or a Pixie Stick? Salt increases the salience of sugar. Which would you rather have, a potato chip or a honey roasted peanut? Like that. So it depends. But in and of themselves, salt and fat do not stimulate the nucleus accumbens. So It's the sugar. But the sugar goes along with the salt and the fat because that's like the trifecta. Yes.
But what do you suggest we, mortals, consumers, professionals, researchers, but people, what can we do to survive?
Well, the first is we got to get educated. Okay. The problem is education alone has never solved any substance of abuse. That's the problem. Did Nancy Reagan's just say no work? We have an opioid crisis. And it's not like we didn't understand that. We did, and it happened anyway. All right. So education alone is not the answer. You can't just say, well, teach people and expect somehow that's going to change. There's a difference between education and implementation. You have to be able to explain to people how to use the information they've gotten in order to change their diet, their lives, their shopping practices, their cooking. Right? And that is something that is much bigger and much more complicated and requires a few more things than just some textbooks.
No, but isn't that in a sense a makeover to save lives?
Absolutely. But I mean, it's doable. Let me give you an example. My nonprofit called Eat Real, and our job is to get real food into schools. We have 213 school districts that we work with, mostly in California, but really around the country, Boston, Boulder, Colorado, et cetera. And what we are doing is we are getting the school system to rethink how meals for students are procured during the day and how those meals are prepared. So that's good, but that's still give me a fish and I eat for a day. The question is, how do I teach you to fish? And so what we're doing is we're actually doing culinary education in the cafeteria with the students. And the cafeteria workers are actually the teachers. And we are teaching knife skills to 4th grade 10-year-olds in order for them to be able to go home and go with their parents to the supermarket and then walk down the produce aisle and say, hey, there's an artichoke. Well, let's have that for dinner. And the mother says, I don't know how to make an artichoke. And the kid says, yeah, but I do. And so they end up becoming the positive disruptive force in the household to actually bring real food into the home. So you cannot just educate the parent. You actually have to educate the kid, and you have to give the kid implementation skills in order to make a difference. Now, having said that, that's on the personal side. We have to then improve our ability to get that mother to buy that artichoke. And that you have to do with policy. And the best way to do that I know of, and the thing that I am absolutely for, and everybody in this country should be for, is to get rid of the food subsidies. Because the only thing we subsidize are things that kill us. If we got rid of all food subsidies, would the price of food go up? And the answer is no, it wouldn't. The Eugenie Foundation at UC Berkeley did this modeling study back in 2009. And they showed that the price of food would stay exactly the same, except for 2 items. 2 items would go up: corn and sugar. Well, those are the things we want to go up to try to reduce effective availability. So the way I look at it is get rid of all food subsidies. Even the libertarians should be on board with that because, you know, subsidies distort the market. Let the market work.
Amen. Now, in the world we live in, currently the Biden administration and so forth, who are the strong advocates for health, for healthy agriculture, for healthy incentives? Who?
Well, there aren't too many.
That's why I asked.
Yeah, and I don't know all of them, but I know of some of them, and I would love to have a line to them. So in Congress, it was Tom Harkin, but remember, but remember also Tom Harkin did not have his come to Jesus moment until he actually said that he was not running for re-election, and then all of a sudden turned on a dime because Iowa, nobody wants to piss off Iowa, including Tom Harkin. But then he started speaking out. And so he now runs his own institute out of Drake University, and he still has some influence, but he's not there anymore. Who else? Is there anyone in Congress who would take this on? The next person who has some skin in the game is Tim Ryan, congressman from Ohio. And he has said that this is an important issue for him. And so we will see if that ends up going anywhere or not. Believe it or not, and this is blows my mind, but back during the Republican primaries of 2015, okay, before things blew up, there was one Republican presidential candidate who actually said, we have to stop the sugar subsidy. And do you know who it was? It was Ted Cruz.
Oh.
Shocking. But he actually got it right. So, there is the potential for being able to make inroads, but it's a pretty desolate landscape for the most part. Now, of note is that Tom Vilsack, who is the former and now present Secretary of the USDA, in his confirmation speech to the Congress on March 4th, so just 6 weeks ago, said that we needed to pivot as a country from food security to nutritional security. And that is a tacit admission of two things. One, the food sucks. And two, it's his fault. And so the question is, did Tom get religion in those 4 years that he was on the outs? And the answer is, I don't know, but I'm waiting to see. Is it possible?
Artemis is in touch with him. Artemis Simopoulos, who we know, Greek Mediterranean diet and so forth, and omega-3 importance, knows him from before and is in touch with him, and she's not sure.
Well, we're all not sure. He's, to be honest with you, Tom Vilsack is a company man.
You don't expect tigers to turn into turnips.
Yeah. So the answer to your question, Dr. Jaffe, is I really don't know. I just don't know.
But you made a very important point from my point of view, which is that the people who lead our country, who are elected by us to guide us, there used to be a connection with the soil. Now it's about dirt. There used to be a connection with you are what you ate, so eat well and be well.
Oh,
and
so
now,
that's a mistake. You are what you eat is a mistake. That is not true. You are not what you eat. I said in my book, Fat Chance, 8 years ago, really, you are what you do with what you eat, because metabolism matters even more than nutrition. And now in this new book, Metabolical, I rephrase it yet again, because the real answer is you are what they did with what you eat. And that's a completely different thing, because the onus is actually on the industry, not on you. So, and that's the reason I wrote the book, is to explain that it's really the food processing. It's not what's in the food that matters. It's what's been done to the food. And the two things that have been done to the food that are the most glaring is the addition of sugar for palatability, of course, and reward and sales, but causing toxicity, especially not protecting the liver, and the removal of fiber, because fiber feeds the gut. Remember, protect the liver, feed the gut. Well, we're flooding the liver and starving the gut. So what do you expect to happen? So who put the sugar in and took the fiber out? Food industry. The question is, can you learn that on the back of a food label? And the answer is no, you can't. That information is not there. It is very specifically withheld from you. So the nutrition facts label cannot tell you whether a food is healthy or not. And this is part of the conundrum.
do you think we should reorganize and have a consumers agency that was responsible to consumers for consumers and pulled all of the different components from FDA to USDA, from Interior to Commerce, because as you know, I'm sure, but I'm not sure our listeners do, person goes out and samples, say 2% of the tomatoes or the pasta, and they come back and they do an analysis and then they report it. And if it's violative and it's on the shelf, it's allowed, but if it's still in the warehouse, it's interdicted and stopped because it's too toxic. And as you have pointed out, there's enough sugar in most marinara sauce that you get in a jar to qualify as a dessert. and we are giving this to our best and brightest, our next generation, to our future. And they're getting sicker.
They are.
Except for, and now I want to ask a question, how about, because we know about organic, how about biodynamic? How about intensive an eco focus on soil quality, water and air quality, seed quality, how to interact with the garden? My front yard is a now 10-year-old permaculture biodynamic food forest. Come and have some lemongrass tea.
I totally get it. Here's the way to think about it. Right? What's the difference between soil and dirt? What's the difference? They're both ground. But what's the difference? Are they the same? They're not the same. Okay. Soil is living and dirt is dead. That's simple. Now, when a plant grows, it has to get nutrients out of the ground in order to do it. If the soil, if the dirt is dead, how do they do it? They don't, unless you spray it with nitrogen fertilizer. All right, and now you've given nitrogen into the soil that the plant can use, because the atmospheric nitrogen is unavailable. It has to be nitrate. It has to have already been fixed. And so nitrogen fixation is what nitrogen fertilizer does. So ammonium, nitrate, etc. So that gets the nitrogen into the soil. Okay, now you can make dirt grow stuff. The problem is that you also contaminate the groundwater. And you now have dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and around the world, and algae blooms and carbon dioxide and climate disaster. So nitrogen fixation is really a problem. Even worse, some of that nitrogen that you spray onto that dirt becomes nitrous oxide, laughing gas. Nitrous oxide, I mean, you don't have enough of a concentration to start laughing, and believe me, we're all crying, but nitrous oxide is the single worst heat trapper of all. We talk about methane. Methane is a friggin' walk in the park compared to nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is 9 times more heat trapping than methane. And it happens every time you spray a nitrogen fertilizer. So the question is, why do you need that nitrogen fertilizer? Well, because the dirt is dead. Well, how'd the dirt get dead? It used to be soil, now it's dirt. And the answer is because we took the cows and moved them from Iowa to Kansas. That's how it went from soil to dirt, because the cows was, they pooping the bacteria into the ground, and it was fixed. And those organisms were busy away churning and making all sorts of amino acids and phosphates and other things that those plants needed to grow. And so the family farm, for lack of a better word, worked.
Yes.
Because
now we only have a few more minutes, and I appreciate the wisdom and the clarity of the conversation. What do you suggest that we, the listeners, the participants, the people who go to the market, the people who eat food, what do you suggest we do?
There's only one answer. Eat real food. Now, the good news is that you vote 21 times a week. You vote with your fork. And ultimately, the food industry, they're not stupid. And, the fact is that they all see this resurgence in this real food concept, and they're all trying to figure out how to make that happen. The more it happens, the more it will, affect them in their bottom line, in their pocketbook, which is the only place they feel anything. And so you have the capacity. The problem is it has to be across the board, and it can't just be, the elites, if you will, the 1%. It's got to be, the 99%. It's got to be everybody. And the problem is they can't afford it. And I understand that. So how can we rethink that concept? And the answer is that is where government has to come in. So how do you make real food available to the masses? There are several ways you could do that. All right. So one is get rid of the food subsidies. That's one. The second way is called differential subsidization. So it's a subsidy, but how about subsidizing the good stuff? So example, in Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, 1977, they had a huge alcohol problem because it was dark and dank and damp, and people were just drinking themselves to death. And they were showing problems on both sides of the ledger. They were showing problems on the positive side of the ledger in terms of decreased productivity because people calling in on their benders. And they were having problems on the negative side of the ledger with cirrhosis of the liver and car accidents. So the three countries all banded together and passed two pieces of yoked legislation. First thing they did, they nationalized all the liquor stores. So every liquor store sold the exact same fare as every other liquor store at the same price, so you couldn't go someplace else and buy it cheaper. Second thing they did was they subsidized low alcohol beer and taxed high alcohol spirits. And they used the money from the spirit tax to fund the low alcohol beer subsidy. So it was a zero-sum game for the government. Government didn't make any money on this, but what they did was they provided the inherent nudge for the populace to want to consume more low alcohol beer and less high alcohol spirits. In other words, they combined the carrot and the stick together. Not a carrot, not a stick, a carrot and a stick. Okay, and the carrot and the stick were yoked together. And it worked. And cirrhosis of the liver and car accidents went down over a 20-year period and stabilized out. Productivity went up. And those two pieces of legislation are still there today because they work. How could you do that in America? How about let's tax sugar beverages and use the money from the tax on the sugar beverages to subsidize water and make water, bottled water, cheaper. Now, people will say, yeah, but that's still a plastics problem. And that is true. And there are ways around that too. There are ways to make that, alter that. Point is, that's called differential subsidization. So tax the bad thing to subsidize the good thing. And that would make more sense than what we're doing right now is subsidizing the stuff that kills us, corn, wheat, soy, sugar. So those are things that the government could do if there was a mind to, and that would help bring real food closer to the populace so that then they could vote with their fork, which would then get the food industry's attention to actually change their practices. So, but you got to start with education. You have to basically tell people, explain to people what the problem is. You cannot solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is. And if you think the problem is calories, you're going to die.
Well, that is a sobering but important message, and we very much appreciate it. Uwe Reinhardt at Princeton, the health economist, certainly agrees with you that we're not just in need of changing the rate of change, we're in need of changing the track and the trajectory, fundamentally getting back to basics, nature, nurture, and wholeness, and a recognition that the quality of how you fuel your mind and body determines the quality of your life to a large extent. So thank you for being you. Thank you for continuing the mission and the campaign. May we all be well and happy, but may we listen to Dr. Robert Lustig.
Thank you, Dr. Jaffe. I so appreciate it, the vote of confidence. We're all in this together. We got to move the needle. We got to get somebody to listen.
Until next time.
Thank you.